I want to do a discussion of the English Civil War. And this is sort of learning by teaching. It is me absorbing knowledge and trying to take notes on it, regurgitate it in order to solidify it, to understand it, so that I can go back and revisit it at a later point. The English Civil War starts in the 17th century with Queen Elizabeth. She sets the taxes very low, and she strives to have good relationships with the Parliament, with the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And she leaves Charles, ultimately, through some of his elder siblings dying off, she ultimately leaves him with a kingdom that is in debt, that is undertaxed, that is left with big religious questions. You know, you've had Henry VIII, who introduced Anglicanism, but also the possibility of Presbyterianism. And at the same time, you still have Catholics, right? And then you have this other group, this burgeoning group called the Puritans. And these four different groups kind of exist in some sense on a spectrum, in that, you know, on the far, quote unquote, right, you have the Catholics. And then you would say on the far left, you have the Puritans. And then in the middle, you sort of have the Anglicans. And then sort of between the Puritans and the Anglicans, you have the Presbyterians. But the Presbyterians are Calvinists, and they are Scottish. They are basically in the same way that the SNP, Scottish National Party, is a political party that really is only followed by Scots and voted for by Scots. Presbyterianism is an ethno-religion for the Scottish people. And Charles is looking at this problem of religion, and he's saying, you know, what we need to do is we need to unite the kingdom religiously. You had the 30 Years' War on the continent over this concept of sovereignty, the Treaty of Westphalia. This question of religion had been fought for, and there are a number of thinkers in England and Great Britain who are saying we need a united religion. We can't have religious differences. We need to be united as a country. And so the compromise that's come up with is a sort of Anglicanism, which is going to have a structure very similar to the Catholic Church. It's just not going to have the Pope as the head. But it's basically going to be Catholicism for the English. The Presbyterians, who are Calvinists, don't like this at all. You know, John Calvin was a reformer. Anglicanism, to my mind, is unique in this respect, and Anglicanism is basically much more similar to early Lutheranism. That is, when Luther was saying, "I'm a Catholic, I'm just trying to reform the Catholic Church," later on he becomes more radical, he becomes more reform-minded. But initially, that kind of spirit of we just don't like the Pope, that had been tried many times before, actually, in Europe. For instance, in the investiture contest with Henry IV, appointed an anti-pope. And that anti-pope, I forget the name of the anti-pope, but he had his own churchly structure in Germany, as opposed to in Rome, that was exactly mirroring the Catholic Church. So this is what Charles was supporting. He said, we're not going to go back to Catholicism, obviously, but we're basically going to recreate the Catholic Church for the English. And the Puritans really didn't like this. And the Puritans were not a unified, codified group. They didn't call themselves Puritans, but they were essentially the Protestants in England who believed that Anglicanism and its formulation as Catholicism for the English was corrupt. And basically the theological and the political here are very closely tied together. That the Puritans hated the concept of Catholic Anglicanism because they were opposed to the concept of hierarchy in the church, that they believed that one of the problems with Catholicism is that Catholics didn't read the Bible. Catholics were not literate. Catholics had a separation between the priest class and everybody else, and Puritans believed that everyone should be part of the priest class. And so you're starting to get the gears turning here of what's going on in this situation. The Puritans are the liberals of their time, that everyone should understand anti-racist sexual ideology. Everyone should be an expert in highly convoluted jargon and understanding privilege, and basically being a little sociologist. Everyone has a responsibility to educate themselves. And really, that's not much more of an undertaking or less of an undertaking than the Puritans saying every single person should read the Bible. That reading the Bible is the prerequisite for, getting closer to God and being a good Christian. It's necessary, and anyone who says you don't have to read it, or it's better to be a good Catholic who doesn't read the Bible than to be... They were all about, there are sacred truths and knowledge, there's an ideological framework, there's a dogma that has to be worked through in the Bible that you can't get experientially, you can't get through some mystical experience, you can't get it through the body, you can't get it through ritual. And so they're denying all these things. And we can see how that spirit still animates America today. Now, we'll give credit to Moldbug, I guess, when Moldbug talks about Calvinism. I mean, the Calvinists in England, they're the Presbyterians, but, you could say that the Puritans are kind of ultra-Calvinists in that sense. We're an elect group of people. And Moldbug says, this Calvinism, this Puritanism develops into the modern American priest class. So the problem with Moldbug's analysis, as many other analyses in my opinion, is that it essentially gets the causal chain backwards. And it says liberals are similar to Puritans, and therefore liberals are a symptom of Puritanism. And while that in some genealogical sense may have an aspect of truth, it's not fundamentally understanding the greater civilizational, sociolinguistic, psychological, religious class shift that's going on, that's independent from Calvinism and Puritanism and liberalism, which is the heightening importance of the priest class. And I think this is actually a take that Nietzsche understands much better than someone like Moldbug, because Nietzsche doesn't put this in such particular terms, right? And people have had that problem with Moldbug before when he places those, he calls it the cathedral, which in itself is a terrible name, right? Because the Puritans hated cathedrals. Cathedrals were a Catholic thing. And he calls it the cathedral. So already there's it's like you're getting basic imagery wrong. I don't like Moldbugs purely on an aesthetic level. But I think also his formulations of his ideas, I think his interview with Tucker wasn't great, where he says it's just a decentralized bureaucracy and there's no deeper understanding that we can have. I think that was pretty weak sauce. I think we can have a deeper understanding. So the English Civil War, as it develops from this conflict between, you have in Ireland, you have these old English settlers, old Irish, and then you have the new, basically Presbyterian Scots who are coming in, New English, Puritans or whatever, those people in Ulster in the north. You have these different groups, and then you've got within England itself, you've got people who support the king and oppose the king at various levels. And so the king, he has two main advisors, both of whom are trash. He has a Bishop Laud, and Bishop Laud is just a jerk, and he's not a good compromiser. He's not the man for the job of bringing the British kingdoms, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. He's not good at bringing them together into a cohesive religious whole. He's very abrasive. He's very aggressive. It's my way or the highway. And so he basically makes an enemy out of everybody that he meets, but he supports the king to the hilt. He really ingratiates himself with the king. He really, is willing to support the king, because the king, in his personal life, his older siblings die who are more confident, more extroverted, more networking, right? They're simply better suited for the task of royal life than he is. And he's kind of an introvert. He's kind of weak. Think of Bashar al-Assad, right? Bashar al-Assad is this kind of weak, sickly dentist or something. His older brother's big, a macho strongman. And then his brother gets killed, and Bashar al-Assad sort of gets dragged into the role of being the ruler of Syria at a time when it's being threatened by terrorists. Part of the reason why the Syrian civil war takes off is because Bashar al-Assad, frankly, was very soft with these terrorists, and he did not clamp down on them. He did not put the boot down the second that they started acting up. He said, well, maybe we can listen to some demands and entertain them and be nice to them, and they're moderates, they're not extremists. And the whole thing went out of control, right? Because he was very soft with these people. And with regard to Charles is also put in this situation where no one respects him. He goes to Parliament, and Parliament is supposed to give him the title of I believe it's poundage and coinage, or poundage and baggage, or something like that. It's a title that enables him to collect taxes, in a sense, or it's one of those financial avenues. And they give it to him for 1 year as opposed to giving it to him for life. And this is basically an insult. And so he's just a young man. He's king. People don't respect him. And one of the very few people who respects him is Bishop Laud. And so Bishop Laud gets into his good graces. But people hate Bishop Laud. And I forget if it's the Lord of Buckingham or something with a B. He has this military commander who is just constantly blundering everything he does. He goes to war against the Spanish, and all of his men, before the night of the attack or something, they just get drunk and walk off the job, And so it's just disaster and embarrassment after embarrassment. Eventually that guy gets assassinated by people from the Parliament, because they're basically looking at these figures that Charles is promoting, these very few figures, and they're looking at them in the same way that the Russian people looked toward, and the Russian nobility looked towards someone like Rasputin. Rasputin somehow, some way had the ear of the royal court, of, the queen or something, and he was able to exert this influence, but they thought he was ruinous for Russia. He was a terrible advisor. He was, perhaps even demonic. And so this is how a lot of people looked at the key advisors surrounding Charles. That was their problem. It wasn't that they hated the king necessarily. It's that he's got like a worm tongue in his ear, and he's being led astray. And this is why we're unhappy with the king. But when those people were killed and imprisoned, a lot of these parliamentarians said, well, we don't really have a problem anymore. But, the king was digging himself deeper holes. He was basically trapped between two camps outside of England. You had the Scottish camp that wanted Presbyterianism. You had the Irish camp that wanted Catholicism. At least the people, the Irish Catholics wanted that. Now, they were ruled by a minority of Protestants, but the Irish Catholics wanted Catholicism, or at least toleration, religious toleration, which was an unusual concept at that time. Whereas in Europe, there was the concept of toleration was on the level of sovereignty, that a sovereign would decide what the religion was, and different sovereigns would respect each other, right? But a certain prince would be Catholic, a certain prince would be Protestant. They wouldn't go to war with each other over that at the Peace of Westphalia, but they would force all their citizens to be Catholic or Protestant, essentially. There would be no toleration. And so the Irish Catholics were arguing for tolerance, which is also interesting in terms of this left-right dynamic. Obviously we think of tolerance as being a left-wing idea, but the Catholics are arguing for it, who are supposed to be on the right. But then another avenue of thought or analysis I want to introduce here is the concept of leftism as a centralization process. And Charles is very much on board with that. Charles very much, he wants to, and the reason why the Civil War kicks off with the Scots in the beginning is because he's trying to force Anglicanism on the Scots. And so he has the bishops there reading from the book of Anglican prayer rather than from the Presbyterian prayers. And they run out the priest and they stone him to death, and they're throwing chairs. It's just a total mess. And immediately they, the Covenanters, they sign a covenant that says, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to have our beautiful Presbyterian Calvinist religion being trampled upon by this crypto-Catholic Anglicanism. And, if the king doesn't give in to our demands, this is basically going to be war. And so King Charles gets himself into a war at the same time that he still hasn't resolved the problem of taxation with the Parliament. And there's the merchant class, right? The merchant class at this point is kind of flexing its muscles and saying, what right do you have, the executive branch essentially, what right do you have to tax us? What right do you have to collect dues? I mean, what about freedom of trade? Why are you taxing imports and exports? All these things that in the past were kind of more normal. This is kind of, this Adam Ricardo kind of theology. I'm saying theology here, but as a political ideology of free marketeer. We don't want this central monarchy. Has nothing to do with the financial side of things, the financial side of government. And so you get this obstruction from Parliament. And it sort of reminds me of the way that Trump's not candidacy, but his presidency was characterized by, he would issue an executive order, and then the Congress or the Senate or some judge in Hawaii would say, no, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. We're not going to go along with that. And so he would say, we're going to build a wall, we're going to put an immigration ban or whatever, we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. The generals would just say no. It was a situation where Charles was completely isolated in his government, and he would issue edicts and proclamations, and people would just say, I don't care. At one point, he tried to go into a prison or a parliament. He tried to access some building, and he said, let me in. And they said, sorry, I can only let in the king. And he said, well, I am the king. And he said, well, I can only let in the man who holds the office of the king. And, that is an office determined by Parliament, because Parliament is the one who issues the laws. Now, the king actually signs the laws, but only Parliament could issue new laws, apparently. And then there was a vehicle they used called ordinances. And so each side in this conflict between king and Parliament, the king, in order to collect taxes, he would use ship money, which is the idea that during an emergency where you wouldn't have time to hold a parliament, you would just extract ship money to raise ships, a navy, to protect England from foreign invaders, Spanish or French or whoever, Vikings, who knows. But what happened was the term emergency, because there's all lawyers in this whole thing, the lawyers of the king were arguing, well, emergency is just a subjective thing and the king can determine whatever that means. And so he just starts collecting ship money arbitrarily as a way to get around the loophole that all taxes must go through Parliament. And so he was raising money in that way. And he was raising ship money from all the counties of England, not just the coastal counties. And so he's introducing this concept of centralization, that if one part of England's under attack, the coastal counties, we're all under attack because we're one united country. And that was kind of innovative for the time. So there's a lot of centralization going on. The merchant class is flexing its muscles. Parliament is flexing its muscles. There's a debate that eventually comes up in the course of the Civil War because Charles has defeated a number of battles, and then you've got these factions within Parliament. You've got more Puritans. The king, they were called the Cavaliers. The Royalists were called Cavaliers. I'm not sure if the term for a cavalier attitude comes from them or if it predates that, and that's why they were called Cavaliers. But it's like a dude with a feather in his cap, and he hates poor people, and that's the stereotype. And on the other hand, you had the Roundheads, people with short cropped hair, who were essentially communists. And it is interesting that at this time, by the time the king's executed, they call it the Commonwealth of England. It's no longer the Kingdom of England, it's the Commonwealth. Which, if you think about that term, wealth held in common, that's basically communism. And there were people arguing at the time that the Roundheads, that the Commonwealthers, that the Puritans, whoever, that these people were communists. They wanted to abolish private property and redistribute the land, which is communism. And so it is interesting to look at this period, when we look at the French Revolution as the origin of the terms left and right? Those who sit on the left side, those who sit on the right side, being the anti-royalists and royalists, respectively. But clearly we can see elements of left and right in the English Civil War. What kind of is the complicated element that I want to introduce is this aspect of centralization that, again, the concept of religious tolerance, it's like, where does that sit? I view religious tolerance as a transitory stage where religion is devalued and made unimportant. It is something that is kind of cynically employed by a minority to protect itself from total engulfment and persecution. In this case, it's the Catholic Irish saying, please give us religious toleration. In other cases, it would be the French Huguenot Protestants saying, give us religious toleration. So religious toleration, the concept of it has been deployed at different times. We see in the Islamic world that a certain degree of toleration is granted to Jews and Christians. This is not exclusive to Western Europe. But even the Mongols, Genghis Khan, had a certain toleration for Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists, right? So there's different forms of religious toleration in empires when you have multiple religious ideologies cropping up and intermixing. The Roman Empire had a certain degree of religious toleration, right? The ancient world is filled with a certain degree of religious toleration. And that difference between monotheism and polytheism, doesn't just end once we're just dealing with Abrahamic faiths, right? Because polytheism is fundamentally the concept that there are multiple avenues of worship and you have the freedom to sort of choose, or at least, an Athenian can worship Athena and a Spartan can worship Apollo, and one is not a heretic to the other. It's a different culture, it's a different religion, it's a different worship. It's different, but the Athenians didn't call the Spartans evil and vice versa for worshiping a different god. That's polytheism. So polytheism is fundamentally religious toleration, whereas monotheism is this fanatical structure that I identify with Zoroaster, where you eliminate all the other possibilities for religious validity and you call those things evil and demonic and devilish, right? Those terms originate with Zoroaster because a Devi is a god, and Zoroaster said all the gods are evil, they're devils. It still is with us thousands of years later. So Charles is at this point where he can kind of side with the Irish Catholics and have some toleration, or he can try to force Anglicanism on the Scottish And then eventually the Scottish position themselves at certain points in the Civil War where they're trying to impose Presbyterianism on England, which in fact, if Charles had agreed to that from the beginning, he probably would have saved himself a lot of trouble. He probably wouldn't have been executed, right? But that avenue was also open. And it's an interesting idea to think of if all of England was Presbyterian rather than Anglican. Rule from Scotland, it would have been an interesting alternative history to think about. It would have eliminated Anglicanism as a religious structure, would have eliminated the religious difference between Scotland and England, would have made Calvinism and John Calvin a much more important figure in the British Empire. That whole religious structure of Presbyterianism would have been passed on. So I guess I'm asking, where do I go from here? I want to keep highlighting this concept of centralization, the centralization of the church in England, the centralization of political structures, tax structures, questions of boundaries of law, a priestly mindset of the Puritans trying to push their way forward and disrupt the old nobility, the killing of a king, the execution of a king, which to me is unheard of. I can't think of another example of a king being killed by his people by a vote of attainder. I believe they basically skip the trial because the king refuses to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty because he regards the court as fundamentally invalid. He asks, by what authority do you try me? They can't give him an answer because typically in English law, things are done by the authority of the king. They don't really have a separate authority. So they do a vote of attainder where it's just a simple democratic vote, yes or no, to kill the king. And, so there's the concept of democracy, and that even explicitly is brought up as the idea of every person in the country should have some sort of vote. Now, it's not necessarily universal suffrage. There's a Republican model perhaps put forth where, the common people will have a representative, rather than voting directly, because there's about 3 million people in the country at that point. So you're not going to get them all in a room and submit a vote or a paper ballot. That's not really thought of at this point. But the idea is that every person, no matter how high or low in the country, should have a voice in the governance. And that argument's put forth. It's pretty much very quickly shot down. But it reminds me of the, Frankfurter Parliament in 1848, where you're having all these ideas put forward that are shot down, but they're introduced in a way that influences later political developments. Of course, this is where we get the Communist Manifesto in 1848. So I'm drawing a parallel here of the discussions that are had in Parliament, where basically communism is suggested and democracy is suggested, republicanism is suggested, religious toleration is floated, right? A lot of these ideas, they don't actually take place as they do in the French Revolution, where they, rewrite the calendar and abolish religion or whatever. Things are actually done in the French Revolution, but the ideas are really started and talked about seriously in this revolutionary time in England. I keep not really finishing the thought about centralization. You have a priest class pushing forward, a merchant class pushing forward. The old warrior class at this point has become kind of weak and decrepit. One of the interesting things about most of the fighters in this civil war is very few of them had experience. The only ones who had experience were the ones who had left England to go to the continent to fight in the 30 Years' War. Prince Rupert is an example. And eventually Oliver Cromwell emerges as a competent general. But prior to Cromwell, and with the exception of someone like Rupert, there are very few men who are experienced in warfare. And it's an interesting problem to have. What it suggests to me is that the warrior class in England was exceptionally weak at this point. And there's a few reasons for that historically, but it was very weak. And so it allowed this merchant class to express itself through Parliament. It allowed a priest class to express itself through Puritanism. And these two forces kind of attacked and undermined Charles at a point when maybe a stronger leader could have resisted those forces, but he was not a stronger leader. He was a weaker leader, and he succumbed to those forces, and he was executed. And the whole concept of a king being killed by a democratic vote is a very revolutionary concept to me. So we may cover what happens next after King Charles is killed, maybe in another video. We also may at some point go back further and ask what was the precedent for some of these things. Maybe look at the 30 Years' War. Certainly, Calvinism, Puritanism has earlier roots. We can look at John Calvin. We can look at the Socinians. We can look back further in Europe's history to find where does the germ of these ideas come from, where we're trying to understand the origins of the left-right struggle, and we're trying to very meticulously track these class developments that form what we call the leftward movement away from what we consider, the right word, the traditional, and whatnot. Maybe a final word to kind of wrap this video up is just that I think what we're going to find is a lot of cyclical repetition in history when we try to analyze things in this way. What we're going to find is that this concept of degeneration of, oh yes, we had this perfect, warrior king and everything. The monarchy was beautiful and we just need to go back to the monarchy and that's the perfect system. Or paganism, that, Christianity is terrible, we need to go back to paganism. You can do this with anything, right? To me, I'm less interested in this idea that there was this golden age in the past where we had the perfect system and then some evil, scheming leftists, liars, Christians, someone came along and just ruined the whole thing through this, process. Nietzsche describes the priest class, beguiles the mob, which actually during this whole conflict, King Charles is worried that the mob is going to kill him because in London, Parliament is putting out these pamphlets and propaganda saying the king is basically an evil man like King Saul in the Bible. And so you see the mobilization of a kind of English BLM, Parliament Lives, PLM, Parliament Lives Matter, and they're creating mobs in the streets of London who are roaming around, kind of gesturing violently toward the king, and he fears if he doesn't do what Parliament says. Kind of reminds me of when BLM was protesting at the White House and they were tearing down barricades and whatever. There you could say January 6th, but the example doesn't work so well because that was directed by Trump rather than opposed. But in any case, yeah, I don't look at this as, these were these perfect governing models and if only Anglicanism had won out, or if only Catholicism had won out, or because Catholicism at a certain point was revolutionary and quote unquote left wing in certain ways. And to me, even paganism has its left wing. The Olympian pantheon or the pantheon of the Aesir is itself patricidal and revolutionary in its own way. And so what happens is you have a left-wing system, that system becomes dogmatized, and then it gets called right-wing in comparison to a new left-wing system. But that ultimately, this is just kind of like the Grand Canyon. It's layers of rock that are layered on top of each other, and at each point in that kind of geological history, that layer is a new layer. We call it left wing, but then it gets papered over or gets stacked on top of by a new layer, and that layer gets called old and right wing. It's the same layer. The position hasn't changed, the structure hasn't changed, it's the same sediment, but it's simply because of this chronological ordering that it's being called now left or right depending on that context. And so Christianity is left or right depending on the context of the time, the chronology. It's opposing an old order, it's introducing a new order. And we can see that, we can feel that, we can understand that in our interpretation of it. But ultimately, I think this desire to get to some kind of objective right wing, it's a psychological need, desire that we have for familiarity and stability and power and truth, and we're trying to find it in that conservative rock, that anchor, and we're trying to escape the disorientation of leftism, which is always new and revolutionary and controversial and ecstatic and Dionysian. We're trying to escape that. But I think that kind of emotional bias that people have in their analysis is rejecting what I view as the necessity. And that's what I kind of mean by the deep left, is I mean that this process is kind of necessary, that the king would not have been executed if he was not a stronger king. If the old monarchy was strong, it would have survived these pressures. And the same thing for paganism, and the same thing for any other quote-unquote right-wing side in a conflict. If it was strong enough, it would have survived. And the only reason it died is because there was some fundamental weakness with the monarchy, with paganism, with any of these things. So that's the note I'm going to leave on. Hope this little summary was enjoyable or entertaining or informative or a mixture of the three. If you did feel that way, you should like the video, because it will promote it to other people, and then the community will be bigger. You can also just send it to your friends and share it with them. And if you're not subscribed, you probably should. And follow me on Twitter. If you do follow me on Twitter, I try to reach out to everybody. I'd love to video chat with you if we've never spoken before. I want to get to know every single person in my audience. You may say, well, that's not feasible. How are you going to get to know 1,000 people? Well, it turns out you're all very shy. So it's actually a very small fraction of people who actually reach out to do something like that. But you can follow me on Twitter. And if you don't follow me on Twitter, I'll never notice your existence, because that's what my settings are. I don't pay attention to anyone who doesn't follow me. But you can follow me on Twitter at Jokull, Jokkkull. Until next time, appreciate your time and attention. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Nice. Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful,
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.